I want to talk about the big story in the corporate inversion world. I've been talking about these inversions and the way companies are being unfairly maligned by Democrats, accusing American corporations of being unpatriotic in their attempt to minimize their taxes. The latest poster boy is Burger King, which announced its intended acquisition of Canadian restaurant chain, coffee chain, Tim Hortons. It's an $11.5 billion deal. 25% of the financing, ironically enough, is coming from Warren Buffett. Mr. Raise My Taxes, corporations aren't paying high enough taxes, helping to finance this inversion. Again, more hypocrisy. We expect nothing less from Warren Buffett. But Canada, of course, enjoys a 15% corporate tax rate, where America has a 35%. And then, of course, then there's also the states that add insult to injury. But not only that, the real savings, because remember, Burger King, a lot of Burger King's revenues, about half their revenues come from outside the United States. But more importantly, the growth is outside the United States. Burger King last year shut restaurants. I think it was about 500 restaurants or something. They closed down in America. Meanwhile, they're opening up a lot of restaurants around the world. So the growth, the future of Burger King, and that's the case with a lot of businesses, is outside the United States, right? And of course, Tim Horton, hardly any of their income comes from the United States. It's almost all Canadian. So paying American taxes is foolish for these companies, especially if, let's say, Burger King earns money in a jurisdiction where the income tax rate is only 10%. Even though Canada's corporate rate is 15%, Burger King would only pay the 10% because Canada doesn't tax the worldwide income of their corporations. But if Burger King, as an American company, were to earn money in a foreign jurisdiction with a 10% tax rate, we would pay 35% because we tax on the American rate. You'd get a credit for the 10% you paid overseas, but your net tax would still be 35%. Now, there are some countries that have no income tax. And if Burger King, as an American company, has revenues there, they're paying 35%. As a Canadian company, they're paying 0. So considering that they're doing this merger, they would have to be idiots to want to be an American company. But the point of my discussing it today is all the criticism about, oh, this is unpatriotic. You got the Bernie Sanders. This is un-American. This is unpatriotic. The shareholders are not being patriotic Americans. Why should they? They're not Americans. Burger King really hasn't been an American company since 1989. I mean, briefly, it might have been, but let me go over the history. Because in 1989, Pillsbury, which owned Burger King, and I forget when Pillsbury bought Burger King, but Pillsbury was bought by Grand Metropolitan, which was a British company. So when Grand Met bought Pillsbury, they owned Burger King. So the British owned it. And then later on, they merged with Guinness Pete, the big liquor conglomerate. And so they owned them. And then they spun it off and took it public. And it was briefly public. Let me see what year it was. I think 2006, they IPO'd Burger King. And then shortly thereafter, in 2010, 3G Capital, which is an investment firm out of Brazil, bought out the company. They took it private. It was a foreign takeover. So it was Brazilian owned. And just a couple of years ago, this Brazilian company, right, 3G Capital, did another IPO of Burger King. And so now Burger King, for the last 2 years, has been publicly traded in New York. And about 30% of its shares are traded. The other 70% are owned by this Brazilian company. So Burger King is Brazilian. Why do Brazilians have to be patriotic Americans when they're not even Americans? And now you're going to have a Brazilian company merging with a Canadian company. What does patriotism in America have to do with Canadians and Brazilians? And if the Canadians and the Brazilians are going to merge to form a new company, why would they be dumb enough to want to subject themselves to the highest corporate tax rates in the world? Why? They're not American. Most of their revenue, after this transaction is completed, the combined company, which is Burger King and D.H. Horton, well over half of their income will be generated outside the United States. Well over. So most of their income is going to come from outside the United States. Why should these foreigners want to subject themselves to the highest corporate tax rates in the world? Does anybody blame them? How can we be saying this is about patriotism when it's not even about Americans? Shouldn't the Brazilians be patriotic to Brazil? Hey, they want to pay the Brazilian tax rate. Or what's wrong with wanting to pay the Canadian tax rate? The Canadians want to pay a Canadian tax rate. Why should they want to pay an American tax rate? I mean, why would anybody want to pay an American tax rate? But, and all of the press that I'm, listening to or reading about this deal, no one focuses on the fact that it's not even an American company. Yeah, it's listed in America, it's incorporated here, but the owners don't live here. They live in Brazil, or they live in Canada. And, this is going to continue. Of course, more and more U.S. companies are going to come under foreign control. And as they do, why on earth would they want to remain subject to the U.S. income tax? Again, the highest income tax in the world. And, of course, Warren Buffett doesn't want to be subject to it either. That's why he's investing in the merged company. That's why he's helping to finance this deal because of the tax efficiencies. The company is more valuable based in Canada. Now, is that the primary motivation for the merger? I don't know. Maybe the merger makes sense for other reasons. Maybe even if they kept the tax base in America, the merger would still make sense. But why? Why would you want to do that? And, of course, Burger King is still going to pay 35% taxes on any money it earns selling hamburgers in America. That's not going to change. What is going to change is they'll pay lower taxes on the money they earn outside of America, provided they never repatriate it. Of course, any money that's repatriated to the U.S., but of course they're not going to do that as a Canadian company. They'll repatriate that money to Canada, and it's not going to be taxed again. But, of course, to the extent that Americans own stock in Burger King and Burger King pays them a dividend, well, they're going to have to pay U.S. income tax on that dividend, right? They'll get a credit for any foreign taxes they paid, but they're going to pay U.S. taxes on their dividends, as all of my clients do. At Euro Pacific Capital, we've got clients. We own stocks all around the world, and those corporations enjoy much lower tax rates than do U.S. companies. But when my clients get their dividends, they still have to pay U.S. taxes on those dividends. They get a credit for the taxes they paid abroad, but since the taxes they're paying here are always higher, that credit simply reduces what they pay the U.S. government, but they still have to pay a high rate of tax.